From the early 1970s through the mid-1980s, an industry was born. Seemingly out of nowhere, this new industry was made from one part silicon, one part imagination, and another part seemingly from magic. Soon after the very first pixels graced the glowing screen, silicon cowboys and cowgirls raced to outdo each other's alchemy. They quickly divided themselves into companies. Some of these would go on to be large and successful, while others would struggle to hang on to a small piece of the pie throughout their existence. The industry of magic and silicon would grow at an incredible rate, thanks to the talent and drive of the wizards designing and manufacturing this brand new technology. Some pixelated heroes would emerge on these flashing screens, becoming pop culture celebrities who would endure well beyond the era of breakdancing and metal lunchboxes. Others would be forgotten or even worse, ignored from the start. Some seemingly indestructible companies would rise to dizzying heights, only to come crashing down in a blaze unlike anything American business had ever seen. For the player, the cost of admission to this amazing magic would be the low price of a quarter. And while some would scoff at these games as mere passing fads or even possibly dangerous, these games created the foundation for not only the realistic polygon monstrosities of today, but for creating an art, a new art form that mixed the science of computing technology with the creativity of the visual arts. With this whirlwind of competition for quarters, a small Florida-based company had seen its shares of ups and downs. In a short span of about 10 years, they had come back from the brink of total failure more than once. Centuri didn't have the deep pockets of some, but they had a strategy that seemed to be working. They would import their brand of magic from Japan, allowing the wizardry of game design from companies like SNK and Konami to do their best spellcasting for American audiences. And while arcade audiences couldn't seem to get enough of the sound and fury coming from these magical boxes, a dark cloud was slowly moving all over the magical world of video games. But for a few glorious years in the early 1980s, magic truly existed for the masses, and the price of admission was the change in your pocket.
I don't think they're good for children.
I think they're pretty neat. That's what I do in my spare time.
I don't like the idea of them standing there pumping money into them.
Yellow creature gobbles dots while being pursued through maze by monsters.
He's a very tough dollar. He's getting tougher. Not easy. We all want that same buck.
Those are the games that don't make it, kid. Getting out of the factory and into the arcades is only half the battle.
Who are you? Centauri's the name. I invented Starfighter, which is why I'm here.
It is?
It is. We have to talk about a matter of utmost importance. Step into my office.
By the start of 1982, video games had officially gone from a public curiosity to a full-blown cultural movement. Arcade games were everywhere, not just in arcades, but they were at the grocery store, in the department store, in movie theaters, at amusement parks, restaurants. They were anywhere and everywhere that had a few feet to spare and electricity. The media also paid attention with countless news stories on not just the popularity of video games, but even in now what seems like trivial panic pieces over supposed addiction or medical issues from loving Pac-Man way too much.
Well, they come as if from outer space in a variety of weird guises. Defender, Pac-Man, asteroids. To fans, they represent a challenge. But to critics, as Terry Drinkwater reports, they are a menace.
For parents.
It's not addictive in the sense of a drug dependency where you're going to have withdrawal symptoms. But it is physically, you can become physically dependent upon it.
People to basically become a society of warriors, we're thinking is very harmful to our society and our society's future.
Are they reduced to violent behavior after Titanic struggles on the screen? Or do they take out their normal aggressions harmlessly, perhaps learning new skills in the process?
Well, now we'd like your opinion on video game violence in another Entertainment Tonight telephone poll. So today's question...
You couldn't go anywhere without being inundated with cereal, cartoons, coloring books, bedspreads, anything that had popular video game faces all over it. Major manufacturers had broken out with hit games that would go on to be some of the all-time arcade classics, such as Williams Defender or Bally Midway's imported phenomenon Pac-Man. A little unknown Japanese company named Nintendo would make a cornerstone of an empire with a game called Donkey Kong. Atari would, however, be the industry giant by 1982, not with just hit arcade games like Centipede, Tempest, and Asteroids, but with an almost total domination of the home market with their Atari 2600. The 2600 would be the home to many versions of Century games also in time. Atari controlled 80% of the video game market in 1982, but Century was not to be counted out. Century's amazing turnaround in 1981 left it in the hunt of the industry giants, and they were hoping to continue to move upward. Things didn't get off to the best start for Century in 1982, when in late 81 they released the poorly received game Roundup, licensed from the Japanese company Hiraoka. This odd puzzle game generated very little buzz and is all but a strange rarity today. Soon after Roundup, Century would release the shooter D-Day, this time licensed by the company Olympia out of Italy. With crude graphics and sounds, the shooter seemed like a color version of similar games from the late 1970s. The game was a huge flop for Century with under 200 games manufactured. Konami's game Locomotion was released next, a typical of the era puzzle-style slider game involving trains. This game is not important so much for the game itself, since it was yet another poor-selling game for Century, but for forming a relationship with Konami. This relationship would shape both companies in the coming years. One of the more interesting licensed games Century would release would also come out in 1982. That game is Tunnel Hunt. Tunnel Hunt was actually designed by Atari. However, the game was seemingly stuck in development hell for several years, according to Atari programmer Owen Rubin, and would go on to originally be licensed to Exidy and renamed Vertigo. When Exidy decided not to produce the game after all, it would be picked up by Century. This must have seemed like a golden ticket for Century at the time, with a unique cabinet and an early attempt at pseudo 3D raster graphics. Tunnel Hunt is an interesting arcade history footnote. Unfortunately, by the time Century got a hold of the game, the graphics were slightly outdated and the game would not be the hit Century desperately needed. It's estimated less than 1,000 Tunnel Hunt games would be manufactured. Not wanting to leave any corner of the globe untouched by Century's licensing, The Pit would be released from UK developer AW Electronics, founded by Andy Walker. The Pit is an interesting game which shares several elements with games like Roby Roto, Dig Dug, and Mr. Do. The Pit seems to have been the inspiration for the game Boulder Dash as well. The Pit tested well in Florida before production, but it can be difficult and a punishing game to play, thanks to a rather complicated play element. The Pit wasn't exactly a hit either, but it would be Century's best-selling game for 1982. Production seems to be around 1,500 to 2,000 units at the most. Century was starting to struggle again when the competition in 82 was bringing out some serious blockbusters. Another in the long line of somewhat off-kilter games for Century would be the game Swimmer. It would be the last game released by Century for the year 1982. Swimmer has gameplay similar to the dodge and avoid style games like Frogger. A player can dive and collect treasure in a river while avoiding sea life and logs. Swimmer is perhaps more remembered by arcade collectors for its garish yet colorful cabinet than the game itself. The brightly colored graphics against a wood grain cabinet are both a product of its time and a product of some questionable artistic choices. Swimmer was designed by Tecmo and has made its way onto several modern platforms as part of classic arcade game compilations. Swimmer was yet another disappointingly low production game for Centauri, with under 1,000 manufactured. Unable to ride the wave of 1981's success, Centauri would go on to lose sales momentum. 1982 sales were a little more than half what they had been in 1981, and the company lost almost $3 million. Centauri was perhaps somewhat saved at this point thanks to diversified investments in other companies, including a chain of sporting goods stores. The Pit was the best-selling game of 1982 for Centauri, and it could be hardly called a hit. Licensing deals for home versions of their games helped keep their head above water as they attempted to change course yet again in 1983. Ed Miller would step down as president of Centauri to form its own company. In his place, Arnold Kamenkow would be the new president. Kamenkow had previously held an executive position at the coin-op giant Bally. The hope was yet another dramatic turnaround was in the cards for Centauri. But the industry was about to be transformed forever in the coming year. Some of these changes would see rising stars that would continue to shine into the 21st century, while other changes would shake a young industry to its knees. Rumblings were being made in financial circles that the video game industry was due for a fall, and that the rising fortunes of many companies was near an end. And in the end, not everybody would survive. At the start of 1983, Centauri would continue to release a number of odd games licensed from Japanese manufacturers. The SNK developed Munchmobile would show up in early '83 with little success. This odd game where a player controls a cartoonish car is unique to say the least. Just as poorly received was the Pac-Man-inspired game Guzzler, originally developed by Tekkon. Guzzler was released only as a conversion kit and is one of many Pac-Man wannabe games from this era. Guzzler might have been one of the first video games to show a character drinking alcohol, which is an odd claim of fame to be sure. One of the more interesting games for Centauri in 1983 would be their only color vector graphic game, and one of the few games Centauri would produce in-house. In fact, it would be the last game Centauri would ever produce as an in-house project. Aztec was developed by programmer Tim Stryker, who would go on to create the influential Major BBS computer bulletin board program in the mid-80s. Aztec is an interesting space-themed shooter with some nice graphics and a very unique bubble dome-like front view window that sits in front of the monitor. It's a gorgeous looking game, and it has even a better looking cabinet. Vector games seemed, however, to be kind of on their way out by '83, with a few exceptions. One could also argue the game doesn't really have a lot of depth as far as gameplay goes. Fewer than 500 cabinets were ever made, and it was yet another flop for Centauri. It would take an Olympic-sized effort to dig themselves out of a hole now that Centauri found themselves in, and an Olympic-sized success is exactly what they would find themselves with soon enough. Centauri would reach back to Konami for their next run of licensed games. Konami had been a major player in the licensed arcade game scene already by 1983, providing hits for many other companies such as Stern and Sega Gremlin. The output of arcade games from Konami was staggering in the early 80s, and they were emerging to be one of the largest video game companies in Japan. The partnership of Centauri and Konami would go on to release a series of classic arcade game hits to audiences in America. This relationship would propel Centauri back into the spotlight as a major player in the arcade business. It also unfortunately would contribute to their downfall from the industry in time. Konami and Centauri entered an agreement in '83 where Centauri would license games developed by Konami for sale as dedicated arcade cabinets, while Konami would sell the conversion kit if they chose of the same title. Conversion kits were becoming increasingly popular with operators of arcade games thanks to their lower cost when compared to buying a new full-size machine. The industry was going through a slight downturn in 1983 that would spiral into what is often called the video game crash of 1983. So let's take a moment here and briefly talk about the video game crash of 1983, a subject that has been analyzed at length and to death by many over the years. Many people like to encapsulate the crash into something like this. Home video game maker Atari made some crappy and disappointing games, which they did, and the market was flooded with subpar products overall, and people stopped buying home video games. While these are definitely factors, there's a much larger picture we need to establish here, and we need to also understand why the crash affected arcade games as well as home video games.
The familiar den of the video arcade is fading out. Business has dropped in half over the past year, and companies like Atari claim losses of more than $350
So let's make a long story bearable here. There were just too many home video game systems on the market and too many different home computers on the market of a entry-level price point. This led to a large price war in between home computers, which also affected the home video game system market. A lot of the product was bad, not just bad software, but also questionable hardware, and a lot of it was the same. On the arcade front, operators were always looking for the next big major hit like Pac-Man, so it became a lot of Me Too similar arcade games that were just coming off as bad Pac-Man clones and bad space shooter clones. Many games were all the same. These arcade games were also everywhere since, like we discussed before, they were at shopping centers and they were at drugstores and movie theaters everywhere. So the saturation of the market was pretty intense. And that led to a lot of games that were rushed out the door, even by major manufacturers, of poor quality. Games were also coming to home systems too soon. This frustrated operators to no end, since a game had a very limited window of popularity in the arcade. At the home use version was almost just as good, since technology on some of the home video game systems and computers had gotten pretty decent. Arcade games were also getting a little more expensive for operators to purchase. Some of this was spurred on by the popularity of the Laserdisc game Dragon's Lair, which was twice as expensive as a traditional upright arcade game. Now, these costs were trickled down to the players, who often had to pay 50, 75 cents, $1 per play for some of these games. So much like the rest of the industry, Centuri's 1983 lineup seemed to be heading into disaster until the first in a series of licensed games from Konami appeared. Although Centuri's first Konami-released game, Locomotion, wasn't anything to write home about, this initial disappointment would soon be forgotten thanks to a series of hits in 1983 licensed from the Japanese video game developer. The first of these Konami-developed games would be Time Pilot. Time Pilot is a multi-directional shooter that allowed a player free range of motion and levels of gameplay that jump through different timeline themes. Players fight enemies from 1910, 1940, 1970, 1982, and even UFOs in the far future of 2001. Players can attempt to save parachuted allies for bonus points as well. Each level contains a boss ship before progressing to the next level or timeline. Time Pilot didn't break any new ground in graphics or gameplay, but it was well enough made and it became a decent hit for Centuri. The designer of Time Pilot, Yoshiki Yokomoto, would go on to develop many future video game classics such as Street Fighter II and Final Fight for Capcom. Centuri would make an estimated 5,000 to 8,000 Time Pilot machines, which came in both upright cabinets and cocktail versions. Konami would distribute a conversion kit of the game themselves without the input of Centuri. The game would also be released in home versions for various platforms at the time, with somewhat mixed results. Konami would release the predictably titled Time Pilot 84 in 1984 as mostly a conversion kit, and it too would be a moderate hit. Time Pilot was a much-needed return to success for Centuri, but this was a drop in the bucket compared to the next two Konami Centuri released games for the USA. The next Konami imported game for Centuri would go on to be considered one of the all-time classic shooters, Gyruss. Gyruss is often described as a morphine of the classic Namco shooter Galaga and the Atari Vector classic Tempest. The gameplay is fast and furious thanks to a unique, chunky, and smooth-actioned joystick known as the Monroe joystick. In Gyruss, you attempt to pass waves of incoming fighters and asteroids who swoop into the screen much like in Galaga, as you travel through the outer reaches of the solar system on your way to Earth. The enemies station themselves after coming into the screen into the center of the screen, which gives the illusion of going through sort of a warp field or a tunnel. Clearing levels will progress the player throughout the planets, and bonus rounds are initiated once a player reaches a new planet. Gyruss was possibly one of the first arcade games with stereo sound, and the soundtrack itself was a big part of the appeal of the game. Gyruss uses a spirited electronic version of Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Sebastian Bach. It's possible this arrangement was somewhat inspired by a similar take on the song by the Australian prog rock band Sky. Gyruss was again designed by programmer Yoshiki Okamoto, who would be fired from Konami soon after the game's release due to a salary dispute. Gyruss was a monster hit for Century, and Century would go to produce about 13,000 to 15,000 copies of the game, in both an upright and a cocktail cabinet version. The upright cabinet featured a new cabinet design for Century, as they would ditch the wood grain style cabinets of previous games for a newer, more modern design. Parker Brothers would release home versions of Gyruss and much of the world on various home console and home computer platforms. Gyruss would also stick around long enough to make its way onto the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1987. There's even a hidden mini-game and a homage version in the game Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. At the 1983 AMOA Trade Show, a show for arcade industry professionals, many arcade developers felt Laserdisc games were the future of the industry. Spurred on by the reactions, initially the full coin buckets of the hit game Dragon's Lair by Cinematronics, it's easy to see why manufacturers were quick to jump onto the Laserdisc bandwagon. Operators of arcade games, however, weren't so convinced. The luster of Laserdisc games was fading as quickly as it seems to have come initially. Laserdisc games were often up to twice the price of traditional arcade games for operators to purchase, and often offered a much faster drop-off of player interest. They also often proved to be less reliable than traditional arcade games of the era. This made recouping the investment of the game much more difficult for the owner of the games. Century was also at the AMO trade show in '83 to show off its Laserdisc offering as well, the game Badlands. Century would steal the show at the AMOA that year, but not with their Laserdisc offering. Instead, a licensed Olympic-themed game from Konami would thrill operators and become an almost instant arcade classic. Track and Field not only bucked the trend of a downturn video game market by offering something truly innovative, it helped popularize the whole new genre of game known as the Olympic event sports game. Track and Field would go on to become one of the biggest hits in Century's history, with about 16,000 to 20,000 units sold of dedicated cabinets. This doesn't even include the conversion kits. One could argue that Track and Field is probably the best known of all of Century's offerings in the company's history. Despite the game being developed by Konami, the idea behind the game was actually from Century's president, Arnold Kamenkow. During the January 1983 dinner meeting with Konami, Kamenkow suggested to Konami they should create an Olympic-themed game to mirror the upcoming 1984 Olympic Games held in Los Angeles, California. In Track and Field, you compete against a friend or a computer player in 6 Olympic-style events. These events include a 100-meter dash, a long jump, a javelin throw, 110-meter hurdle race, a hammer throw, and a high jump. Playing against a friend could create some amazing gaming experiences thanks to the added element of physical button pressing endurance. The communal nature of Track and Field makes it one of the great all-time multiplayer arcade games. There are 2 control panel versions of the game, one with buttons and another with trackball controllers. Using the buttons or a trackball to gain as much speed as possible, the player then attempts to break speed records or distance records depending upon the event. This can lead to some rather interesting techniques for the player and some tired fingers. There are also a number of hidden tricks and bonuses in the game, which can present themselves with cameos of characters from other Konami games. Track and Field would go on to inspire many local and national contests during its initial release. The theme music is an electronic version of the theme from the movie Chariots of Fire. Unlicensed, of course. Outside the US, the game was also a success, but it would be called by its original name, Hyper Olympic. This name was changed in the USA due to a copyright dispute over using the word Olympic in a video game from Atari. This was possibly over their Atari 2600 game, Video Olympics. Century offered the game in an upright cabinet, a cocktail cabinet, as well as conversion kits. Track and Field would open the floodgates to multi-event sports games for years to come. This included the Summer Games series by Epix, which seemed to come out in endless varieties throughout the 80s and the 90s. Activision's extremely similar game Decathlon was released almost at exactly the same time as Track and Field in the USA. Although some people have given credit to Track and Field for inventing this button smash style Olympic event game, Track and Field was far from the first game of its type. The originator of this theme goes to a rather obscure computer game called Olympic Decathlon. Olympic Decathlon was released by Microsoft for the TRS-80 computer in 1980 and was written by Timothy Smith. Later versions for the Apple II and the IBM PC would also be released. Track and Field's tie-in with the 1984 Olympic Games probably helped with its success. Home versions of Track and Field would be released starting in 1984 across multiple platforms and even LCD handheld games. A strangely decent version for, at that point, the quickly aging Atari 2600 system was also created. Track and Field will continue to see new versions and variations on its theme for years and generations of new systems to come. The legacy and success of Track and Field might have been the high watermark for Century as a video game manufacturer. It created a buzz in the industry that was facing a massive downturn, which was no easy feat at the time. Track and Field is proof that arcade players still wanted to play arcade games. They just wanted games that were fun to play with their friends and offered a long-term play value.
4, 3, 1, Happy New Year!
Despite the continued downturn in the market at the beginning of 1984 for video games both at home and in the arcades, Century and Konami knew they couldn't rest on such a great concept as the success they had with Track and Field, and they quickly brought out a follow-up titled Hypersports. The control scheme and theming is almost the same as Track and Field, but with new and varied events. Hypersports lessened the importance of quick button mashing and focused more on the timing of action in these events. These events included a freestyle swim, skeet shooting, long horse, archery, the triple jump, weightlifting, and pole vaulting. Although exact production figures are unknown, it appears that Hypersports was almost just as popular as Track and Field. Century seemed to be bucking the trend of a downturn market for video games with 4 massive hits in a row. Konami would even invest in Century thanks to the success of Track and Field. In true Century fashion, however, it simply wasn't destined to last. Century would release 3 more Konami-developed games in 1984, but these would be the last 3 games Century would ever release. The industry downturn was not showing signs of improvement, and many companies were starting to bail out of video games. Century would release the multi-event game Circus Charlie, designed by Konami in 1984. Circus Charlie takes the concepts of multiple mini-games like the previous hit Track and Field, but it adopts it into a circus setting. Events can be chosen by the player in any order for the most part. Some events will add new or more difficult elements as you progress through the game. Circus Charlie was available in a dedicated cabinet, a dedicated cocktail cabinet, and as a conversion kit. The upright cabinet is a modified version of the design that was used for the game Gyruss. Production numbers are unknown for Circus Charlie, but it was the most successful of the last 3 Century released arcade games. According to rather cryptic data published in the 83 and 84 Century annual reports, it seems like the total combined production of the last 3 Century games, which are Circus Charlie, Badlands, and Mikey, was somewhere around 2,000 to 3,000 units in total at the very most. Circus Charlie was by far the biggest hit of the 3 games, and I would estimate around 60 to 70% of the production total here. With its colorful, cute graphics and variety in gameplay, Circus Charlie would go on to become a minor hit for Century. It was well received by players and arcade machine operators. Home software video game manufacturer Parker Brothers quickly secured the home video game rights. Unfortunately, Parker Brothers would soon get out of the home video game business, and their home version adaptations would never see the light of day. Eventually, home computer versions would be released, but mostly outside of the USA. With a downturn in the video game market, a title as playable as Circus Charlie may have been a bigger hit if it had come out a year earlier. For Century, this game would unfortunately be the last glimmer of hope for video game arcade success. Now, back at the 1983 AMOA trade show, Century had showed off its Laserdisc offering from Konami, Badlands. It was a poorly received game at the trade show, even by the standards of an industry that was quickly cooling off from the concept of Laserdisc games. Despite billing itself as a game themed around the American Old West, Badlands really comes across more of a strange Ed Wood-like movie version of a Western than a serious Western-themed game. You play a cowboy named Buck, who is also a frontier family man. When your wife and children are killed by a gang of outlaws, you seek them out for revenge and bounty. The game is essentially just a quick draw contest as you progress through the story. There's no directional joystick, only a large button to shoot and a smaller one to skip a scene. The animated footage includes some monsters as well as out-of-place comedic death scenes. The quality of the animation isn't nearly as fluid or smooth as the Don Bluth-produced Dragon's Lair or Space Ace. The controls are very limited and the interaction feels disconnected. The slightly laggy nature of Laserdisc, mixed in with a very small window in which the player can actually shoot their gun, makes for a frustrating and almost unplayable game. Badlands tanked, and very few of the expensive dedicated versions of the games were sold. Once the game was deeply discounted, conversion kits found their way into the hands of the United Artists movie theater chain, who had their own custom arcade game cabinets for games. Even by Laserdisc game standards, Badlands presented a player with a very disappointing gaming experience. Badlands would be the only Laserdisc game Konami would ever develop. During its entire history, it's safe to say that the Allied Leisure Century Corporation released some rather odd and off-the-beaten-path games. These unique games, which did not necessarily find financial success or love from a large number of game players, is part of what makes the Century story such an amazing part of arcade game history. With this in mind, it's rather fitting that Century's last arcade game released would be one of the most original yet bizarre games they would ever produce. It's possible that Mikey was just way ahead of its time, attempting to make a sandbox-like platform game with a complex rule set was maybe just outside the realm of game design or technical power in 1984. Mikey is a game that rewards a player who is willing to accept a huge learning curve in order to play it. The game is brutally difficult to play at first, has a complex and confusing rule set, and some questionable collision detection. Mikey again was developed by Konami, like many of the last games Century would release. As Mikey, your job is to collect hearts on each main level, which takes place in a different room inside a multi-level school. In the first level, it takes place in a classroom, and you have to hip check your fellow students out of their seats in order to collect the hearts. In other levels, hearts can be touched or required you to bang your head into things. In the Century version of the game, Mikey also has the ability to headbutt teachers and facility members, which will stun them for a limited amount of time. There's also additional play mechanics depending upon the room that you're in, and even a few hidden secrets for additional bonus points. Timing of the headbutt attack is very touchy and requires a bit of patience to learn the exact timing. The game features some nice graphics and some great chiptune versions of classic Beatles songs. It appears that Konami had licensed the music officially for the Japanese release of Mikey, but Century never bothered to do so for the American version. There are actually 3 different versions of Mikey. Despite the Century marquee describing the game as High School Graffiti Mikey, the Century version is just considered to be Mikey on the game screen itself. A second version of the game for the non-US market is actually titled High School Graffiti on the title screen and has some subtle differences, including replacing the headbutt attack with a scream. This attack makes the game even more difficult to play, since the scream attack has slightly a shorter range than the headbutt attack. In Japan, the whole theme was reworked from a school setting to an office setting. The Japanese version was reworked in this way in order to be sensitive to a wave of Japanese school violence episodes of the time. Otherwise, the gameplay is pretty much the same in Japan and would see an official release for the Sega Mark III home video game system. This game would never make it over to the Sega Master System, perhaps just being too regional specific to Japan for international audiences. Mikey is a fascinating game. It attempts to combine multiple levels with some interesting world building for 1984. However, with its confusing rule set and a punishing difficulty for new players, it's not surprising that Mikey wasn't a success. Mikey would find its way into several home versions, but not in the USA. This includes a rather decent version for the Commodore 64 computer. Mikey is an obscure game, even to die-hard arcade game fans. Very few Mikeys were ever made, and although it was available as a dedicated cabinet, these cabinets seem to have been leftover Circus Charlie cabinets that were converted at the Century factory. And they would be the last cabinets ever to roll off the assembly line for Century. Soon after the release of Mikey, Century would close the video game division and end an almost 20-year run of manufacturing arcade video game products. Unsold Mikey conversion game kits would be sold at clearance by liquidators. I find it somewhat poetic that a game as innovative and odd as Mikey would be the last game Century would release, given the company's rich history of producing odd yet innovative games. After Century abandoned the video game market, they continued to struggle despite diversifying into several other business ventures throughout the early 80s. Being part of a larger group of companies known as the Kaufman Group, Century became an investment company for other companies. These companies were as varied and as unusual as many of the video games they had produced, from sporting goods companies, boat repair, mobile home manufacturing, and even into seafood processing. Century seems to have had their hands in a bit of everything. Around 1986, Century's headquarters were moved from Florida to Vestal, New York. And despite not being in the video game business anymore, the ups and downs, crash and burn history of Century seems to have followed it into each new endeavor. This is typical of mid-80s and 90s businesses, as Century's parent company seems to have been using Century as a front for corporate takeovers of other corporations. In 1993, it seems Century's luck finally ran out. The company would file for bankruptcy once again and eventually would be absorbed by creditors and its parent company. Although the name Century Inc. still lives on as an energy construction company, it appears not to be related to the original Allied Leisure Century Company in any way. The classic arcade game wizards at Allied Leisure and Century left a legacy of interesting, entertaining, and innovative products. Sometimes magic isn't meant to last forever, but over the span of almost 3 decades, despite the numerous ups and downs, Century held their own against bigger companies. Century did exceedingly well against the competition in a market considering after 1980, they designed very few of their own games. Centuri's partnership with Japanese manufacturers would be both a blessing and a curse. The reliance of outside companies on product was cheaper, but eventually these companies just wanted a bigger piece of the pie and more control over their own destiny. Centuri was an important voice in introducing several important Japanese gaming companies to American audiences, allowing for a more diverse gaming experience to early 1980s gaming patrons. For many of Centuri's famous licensed partners, they would go on to find success after 1984 as the video game market would eventually rebound. The colossal success of the Nintendo Entertainment System a few years later proved to be a boom for many Japanese software developers. Centuri's most successful partner, Konami, would go on to become one of the biggest third-party software companies for the NES. Konami would produce hit home games for decades on many different platforms. Konami continued to produce arcade games as well, and even though arcade games would never see the height of popularity in the USA as they had in the Golden Age, they would still find success with these machines. Today, Konami produces not only popular software on a variety of platforms, but also slot machines, trading cards, toys, and even movies. It must have been fate that one of Centuri's most successful games would be called Phoenix. Centuri literally burned to the ground once, only to rise from the ashes again and again. The wild variety of games Centuri would offer in its lifetime, some successful, others not so much, add to the rich and colorful history. For the price of a quarter, Centuri allowed players to enjoy their special flavor of video game magic. Centuri's spellcasting on American arcade audiences was perhaps gone too soon, like so many of the unsung gaming companies in the early 80s. Luckily, we can revisit Centuri's particular style of magic today, thanks to various digital platforms and the rise of vintage arcades. As a company, Centuri may have run out of lives. Fortunately for us, we can always get a few more for the price of a quarter.